The first whisper of winter in Victorian London never arrived with ceremony. It crept in silently, in the way the morning fog thickened. How the breath of a horse turned white in the cold air. How the windows of crowded tenements gathered frost long before December was fully underway. In the 1800s, winter meant more than a change of season. For the poor and working class, it meant a slow battle for survival. Imagine a city where coal smoke hung heavy in the streets, mixing with the damp mist of the Thames. By late November, a dull grayness seemed to settle permanently over the city. The sunlight, already scarce, felt weaker, as if the sky itself had grown tired. The streets grew slick with frozen mud, and horse-drawn carriages clattered over stones glazed with ice. In the wealthier districts, places like Mayfair or Belgravia, the wealthy huddled in parlors, warmed by grand fireplaces. But in the East End, where families packed themselves into single rooms of drafty buildings, the cold seeped into bones, blankets, and dreams alike. For the poor, the winter was not merely an inconvenience. It was a death sentence waiting quietly at the door. Children in thin clothing wandered the streets, their small boots splitting at the seams. Coal, the very heart of warmth, was sold at a price many could not afford. Some families bought coal by the handful, wrapped in paper cones, only enough to burn for a single meal or to warm their hands for a brief hour. When that was gone, they shivered under thin quilts, their bodies curled together, hoping the night would pass quickly. The frost was most unkind to the elderly. In tiny lodgings, grandmothers and grandfathers sat silently in corners, their joints stiff from the chill. Even moving became painful. Every winter, newspapers quietly recorded spikes in death rates among the old and the very young. It was the silent toll of the season, so common that few were surprised anymore. The streets of London told their own story. By dusk, gas lamps glowed weakly through the fog, their halos of light barely cutting through the mist. Street vendors wrapped themselves in scarves and sold roasted chestnuts, the scent mingling with the sharp tang of coal smoke. Beggars sat at corners, their hands outstretched, but fewer coins were dropped in the winter. Everyone seemed to be holding tighter to what they had. And in workhouses, men and women shuffled in, seeking shelter and a bowl of thin gruel, grateful at least for a roof over their heads. But it was the River Thames, winding through the heart of London, that revealed the most haunting image of winter. On especially bitter nights, thin layers of ice formed along its edges. Long gone were the famous frost fairs of earlier centuries, but the idea that the great river could still freeze struck fear into the poor. If barges couldn't move, trade slowed, and with it, wages for dock workers, ferrymen, and others who relied on the river for survival. The winter did not just bite with cold, it strangled livelihoods. As December deepened, sickness always followed. Cold, damp rooms bred pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza. Medicine was a privilege many could not afford, and doctors often demanded payment up front. Mothers sat through long nights, listening to the coughing of children, praying it would ease by morning. Too often it didn't. Small wooden coffins became an unremarkable sight, carried quietly through narrow streets toward crowded cemeteries. Yet, amidst all this, life carried on. London was a city of contrast, grand banquets and glittering theaters on one side, hunger and frostbite on the other. The carriages of the wealthy rolled through snow-lined streets, the passengers wrapped in furs. Meanwhile, chimney sweeps, factory girls, and dock workers trudged home through the same snow, their fingers numb, their bellies empty. Winter in Victorian London was not only about cold weather. It was about the deep line drawn between rich and poor. To the privileged, the cold was inconvenient. To the poor, it was brutal, merciless, and often final. And so, as the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out across the city, echoing into the night, another winter descended upon London. A winter that would test patience, strength, and survival in ways only those who lived it could truly understand. As the frost thickened across London, the struggle of daily life revealed itself in the smallest details: what a family ate, what they wore, and how long a fire could last. In the winter months, every decision became a matter of survival, and every penny stretched to its breaking point. For the lower classes, bread was the very center of existence. A small loaf, dense and heavy, could make the difference between going to bed with a full stomach or lying awake with hunger gnawing at one's ribs. The bakers' shops, warm from their ovens, became both a beacon of hope and a reminder of poverty. Passing by, the scent of freshly baked loaves filled the air, almost mocking those who had no coin to offer. Children pressed their noses against frosted windows, staring at rows of bread they could not touch. The price of bread often rose in the winter, as flour supplies were affected by weather and trade. For families already on the edge, this small increase could be devastating. Mothers watered down stews to make them last longer, stretching thin scraps of meat and vegetables into meals that were more liquid than substance. A piece of stale bread, dipped into this watery broth, was sometimes the only food a family shared by the light of a single candle. Then there was cold, a black heart of warmth. Without it, a home was nothing more than a box of cold bricks, a place where frost crawled across the walls. Coal was sold by weight, and while the wealthy ordered it by the ton, the poor often bought it in handfuls, measured out into small paper cones. These tiny purchases, known as coal by the pail, were all most could afford. The fire they made burned hot for an hour or two, filling the room with blessed warmth, but then it faded, leaving behind ashes and smoke. Some scavenged coal from the streets, gathering the small black lumps that fell from delivery carts. Children searched along railway tracks for bits that had tumbled from trains. To find even a few pieces was to secure another hour of warmth. But more often there was nothing to find, and families huddled under thin blankets, their own bodies pressed together to create heat. Clothing was another silent battlefield. Winter coats were luxuries, not possessions of the working poor. Instead, they layered what they had: threadbare shirts, worn waistcoats, patched trousers. Women wrapped themselves in shawls so old and thin they let the wind pass straight through. Boots, once sturdy, split open at the toes, letting in snow and water. Many walked with newspapers stuffed inside their shoes, a fragile barrier against the wet and cold. The wealthy, of course, were wrapped in heavy furs and fine wool coats. Carriages carried them through the icy streets, their feet warmed by hot bricks placed on carriage floors. Inside their townhouses, fireplaces roared in every room, and kitchens filled with the rich scent of roasted meats. But for those on the other side of the city, survival meant endurance, enduring hunger, enduring cold, enduring the knowledge that each day brought no relief, only more of the same. The workhouses, grim though they were, became a place of last resort. Men and women entered reluctantly, knowing that they meant separation from family and the loss of freedom. But the promise of warmth, however harshly won, was too strong to ignore. Long rows of bodies lay side by side on hard beds, warmed by the breath and closeness of others. It was not comfort, but it was not the street either. And still, life went on. Market stalls sold root vegetables, turnips, carrots, dirt, clinging to their skins. These were boiled into stews, soft and simple, filling if not satisfying. On rare nights, a lucky family might add a small piece of meat, usually bone and gristle, more than flesh. The aroma filled their one-room lodgings, and for a moment there was joy in the air. The sound of the city in winter was unlike any other season. The clatter of horses' hooves on frozen cobblestones, the crunch of boots on snow, the occasional cry of a street vendor shouting through clouds of breath. It was a quieter London, muted by cold, the fog and frost swallowing noise as much as it swallowed light. For those who endured it, every day of winter was a negotiation between hunger, poverty, and the will to survive. Bread and coal, two of the simplest things in life, became the very currency of existence. And for the lower classes, the lack of both turned every winter into a season of hardship and loss. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the cold in Victorian London did more than chill the skin. It seeped into the lungs, the blood, and the bones. In cramped rooms where dampness clung to the walls, winter became the perfect breeding ground for illness. For the poor, sickness was not a matter of if, but when. Coughing was the season's most common sound. Children's small bodies shook with fits that seemed never to end. Mothers pressed damp cloths against their foreheads, whispering prayers by candlelight, hoping the fever would break before morning. But often the fevers grew worse. Pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza, these names carried fear, for they spread quickly and claimed lives silently. The cold made weak bodies weaker. Malnourished children, already thin from poor diets, stood little chance against infection. Old men and women, their strength fading with the years, found themselves unable to rise from bed once the illness took hold. The poor relied on home remedies, mustard, plasters, onion, soups. Vinegar rubbed on the chest passed down through generations. But remedies rarely worked against diseases worsened by hunger and bitter air. Doctors were a luxury. Even a single visit cost more than many could afford. Instead, families sought the charity hospitals, long corridors lined with iron beds where the sick lay side by side in the dim light. Nurses moved between them, their arms full of medicines and cloths, while the sound of coughing and labored breathing filled the ward. Yet even here there was never enough medicine, never enough space, never enough care to match the sheer number of sick who poured in during the winter months in the alleys and narrow courts of the East End. Illness spread like fire. One sick child meant an entire household would soon be coughing. In overcrowded tenements, where dozens lived in a single building with shared privies and water pumps, contagion was inevitable. Diseases that modern medicine can manage today, such as tuberculosis were, then a lingering death sentence. The cough of consumption, deep and rattling, haunted many families through long winters, year after year. Work did not stop for sickness. Factory bells rang in the morning, regardless of fever or chill. Men dragged themselves to docks, workshops, and mills, knowing that missing even one day's wages might mean no food at all. Children, too, worked despite illness. Tiny figures shuffled into match factories and textile mills, coughing into their sleeves as they toiled. Winter had no mercy for weakness, and poverty had no patience for rest. Meanwhile, in the wealthier districts, sickness was met with comfort. Doctors visited homes lit with warm fires, bringing medicine and advice. Families had broth, blankets, and servants to tend the ill. A cough was an inconvenience, not a danger. The same city, the same season, but a world apart. And yet, even among the wealthy, fear lingered. Epidemics did not always respect social boundaries. Cholera outbreaks in earlier decades had shown how swiftly disease could sweep through London, carried by polluted water and poor sanitation. Even the most gilded homes could not always keep sickness out. Winter reminded everyone, rich or poor, that the human body was fragile and life was uncertain. Death in the winter was a quiet presence. Coffin makers worked steadily, their craft a constant demand. Churchyards filled with small mounds of earth, each one marking a story ended too soon. For many families, grief became another weight to carry alongside hunger and cold. And yet, life continued. The living trudged forward through the frost, because they had no choice but to endure. In Victorian London, sickness was as much a part of winter as snow and fog. It waited in every damp corner, in every crowded room, in every weak and weary body. And for the poor, each breath of icy air carried the unspoken fear: will this be the winter we survive, or the one we do not? Winter did not simply rest upon Victorian London. It claimed the city. The streets, already narrow and crowded, became harsh corridors of ice, fog, and silence. When frost settled overnight, the cobblestones gleamed white in the morning, slick and treacherous. Horses slipped on the stones, their hooves clattering, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Carriage wheels left long, muddy tracks across snow that quickly turned gray and black with soot. The fog, ever present in London, grew thicker in the winter. It mingled with the coal smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys, creating the infamous London fogs that rolled like ghosts through the streets. Sometimes the fog was so dense that a person could not see their own hand in front of them. Lanterns glowed dimly through the haze halos of pale yellow that guided weary travelers home. But for many, the fog was not mysterious or romantic. It was suffocating, heavy, and full of smoke that burned the lungs. Markets carried on, though winter changed their tone. The cries of vendors were muffled by scarves wrapped around their faces, their words rising in clouds of steam. Baskets held root, vegetables, turnips, onions, dirty but filling. Fishmongers displayed their wares on slabs of ice, their fingers stiff as they scaled and chopped. Roasted chestnut sellers were among the few to bring warmth. Their little braziers glowed red against the gray world, and the smell of roasting nuts drifted across the market squares. Children gathered, hoping for a sample, their cheeks red and raw from the cold, Workhouses stood like grim fortresses against the frost. Their heavy doors opened each evening to a line of desperate figures, men and women too weary to fight another night in the streets. Inside, warmth came at the cost of freedom. Families were split, men on one side, women on another, children placed apart. The meals were meager, a bowl of thin gruel, perhaps a crust of bread. Beds were crowded, and privacy did not exist. But compared to sleeping in the open air, even these harsh shelters were salvation. Those without workhouse entry drifted toward lodging houses or huddled under bridges by the Thames. The river itself, dark and wide, seemed to breathe cold into the city. Its surface grew crusted with thin sheets of ice near the edges. Barges moved slowly, weighed down with coal and goods, their hulls pushing through the frozen waters. On bitter nights, the sound of the river was muted. The current slowed, as though even the Thames itself had grown tired of winter's wait. Street sounds reflected the season. The clatter of carts was slower, as if pulled by weary horses struggling against icy roads. The cries of beggars were more urgent, voices strained with desperation. And yet, silence often ruled the hush of snow falling in the night, the quiet of entire neighborhoods retreating indoors, fires low, children asleep, the cold pressing against thin window panes. In the wealthy districts, winter looked different. Houses glowed with candlelight, fireplaces roared, and dinner parties continued. Carriages carried their passengers through frozen streets, the riders warmed by thick blankets and fur wraps. Theaters hosted audiences who arrived in fine cloaks, shaking snow from their boots before settling into plush seats. But even there, the cold left its mark. Icicles hung from ornate iron railings, and frost drew lacework patterns across polished windows. For the poor, the streets became a test of endurance. Newsboys, with stacks of papers tucked under their arms, shouted the day's headlines, their fingers numb, ink smudging on their skin. Matchgirls, their baskets slung at their sides, struck matches in the dark to warm their hands, even though every flame meant less to sell. Hawkers sold cheap trinkets, cloth scraps, or hot pies, hoping for a coin or two before the night swallowed the day. London under snow was not quiet. Beauty it was survival etched into every step, every cough, every breath that hung white in the frosty air. Children played when they could, sliding on icy patches, their laughter briefly cutting through the gloom. But even their joy was short-lived, for cold soon drove them back to doorways and hearths, if they had them at all. And so the city endured, one day at a time. Winter painted its gray and white across the rooftops, dimmed its fog lamps, and pressed itself into the heart of every family. It was in the coal smoke, in the frozen mud, in the endless search for warmth. It was everywhere, unavoidable, unmerciful. London wore its winter like a heavy coat that no one could remove, and the poor carried it most of all. Winter in Victorian London was not only a battle of body, but a battle of spirit. The cold air seeped into bones, but it also crept into the mind, dulling joy, slowing thought, and leaving people with a sense of heaviness that no fire could truly lift. For the poor, each day began with the same question: would they endure? Hunger gnawed as steadily as the frost, and the short days meant little chance to earn money before the darkness returned. The streets themselves seemed to press down on the spirit. The fog, a curtain that blotted out hope as much as it hid the skyline. Loneliness was sharper in winter. A single person walking through the fog, their footsteps echoing faintly against the frozen cobbles, might feel swallowed by silence. Neighbors who once stood on doorsteps to chat withdrew indoors, their doors bolted, windows shuttered against the icy drafts. Social ties frayed when survival demanded focus inward in family, on self, on firewood that might run out before the week was done. Workhouses magnified this sense of isolation. The rules there stripped away identity. A man became just another body in a row of cots, a woman just another face in the soup line. Children cried for mothers they could not see, separated by walls and rules. A sense of despair settled over those who had little to look forward to but another gray dawn. Yet, in the bleakness, tiny sparks of resilience glowed. Families drew close around fires, no matter how small. A single candle might light a whole room, its glow more precious for the darkness outside. Friends shared crusts of bread or a coal or two, knowing survival was easier together. Even the smallest kindness, an old shawl passed down, a shared bowl of stew was enough to keep the spirit from breaking entirely. The wealthy, though shielded by comfort, were not untouched. Letters and diaries from the era speak of gloom that seemed to settle over even the grandest houses. The endless fog dimmed the beauty of gardens and streets, and though fireplaces roared, the weight of winter pressed heavily on conversation. Some spoke of melancholy, what we might call seasonal depression now. Doctors prescribed tonics, walks, or time abroad, but for most Londoners, escape was impossible. Children, however, were often the light in the darkness. Their laughter, even thin and weary, carried hope. Games of sliding on icy paths or building rough snowmen broke through the stillness. Even in the workhouses, children invented play, carving toys from scraps of wood, or telling stories under thin blankets. Their imaginations cut through the monotony of survival. Religious institutions also played a role. Churches, lit with candles and echoing with hymns, offered more than warmth. They gave people a sense of belonging, a reminder that suffering was shared and not borne alone. Sermons spoke of endurance, of the cold as a test, of spring as a promise. For many, these words were enough to kindle inner strength when the nights stretched endlessly. Winter also sharpened the contrast between rich and poor, and that contrast weighed heavily on minds. To walk past a grand house glowing with light, music drifting faintly through its windows, while standing shivering in the street, could break the heart. It reminded many of their place in a city divided. Yet, strangely, it also fueled resolve and unspoken determination that one day life might be better, even if such a dream felt impossibly distant. In those months, balanced constantly between despair and resilience. Despair whispered with every empty stomach, with every night of frost creeping through thin blankets. Resilience answered in the shared smile of a neighbor, in the stubborn act of waking to face another frozen dawn. And so London endured, not just in body, but in spirit. The city carried on through the fog and the cold, one soul after another, finding their own fragile ways to keep the flame of endurance alive. When winter descended on Victorian London, life itself became a constant negotiation with the cold. Survival meant more than enduring the chill. It meant altering every detail of the day, how one dressed, ate, traveled, and even slept. Clothing was the first line of defense. For the wealthy, fashion met function. Heavy wool coats lined with fur, thick gloves, and elegant hats to ward off frostbite. Women layered petticoats beneath gowns, sometimes so many that walking became slow and cumbersome. Boots with fur trim helped, though icy streets still made movement treacherous. For the poor, however, clothing was patchwork at best. An old coat passed from father to son might be worn until the seams split. Scarves were nothing more than strips of cloth, and shoes often leaked, soaking feet in the slush. A child might walk barefoot in snow, skin chapped red and raw. Food became equally critical. For the wealthy, winter tables groaned with roasted meats, puddings, steaming pies, and mulled wine, spiced and fragrant. Kitchens in grand houses glowed with warmth from great hearths, and servants worked tirelessly to prepare meals that banished the cold. The poor, by contrast, made do with what they could scrape together. Bread and dripping, a thin broth, or potatoes roasted over a street fire were common meals. Some families resorted to boiling bones for days, drawing every drop of nourishment from them. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts or hot eels, their stalls clouded with steam that lured passersby. Desperate for warmth and sustenance, work routines were shaped by the season. Laborers woke before dawn, their breath visible in the freezing dark, trudging through icy alleys to docks, factories, or construction sites. Workhouses put inmates to labor even in the cold, breaking stones or picking oakum with stiff fingers. Street sweepers hacked at ice, clearing paths with shovels. Chimney sweeps, often children, braved flues that were colder and more dangerous in winter, soot sticking to damp walls. For those without steady employment, winter was cruel. Begging became the only work left. A desperate plea whispered on frosty street corners. Travel through the city changed entirely with the season. Carriages rattled over cobblestones slick with frost, horses' hooves slipping dangerously. Some animals collapsed in the streets, their bodies left stiff in the cold until carted away. Omnibuses grew crowded, passengers huddling shoulder to shoulder for warmth. Those on foot struggled with fog so thick it erased landmarks, leaving even lifelong Londoners disoriented. Street lamps offered little help. Their glow was swallowed by mist, reduced to faint orbs floating in a sea of gray dot inside homes. Warmth was precious. Fires were tended constantly, coals carefully rationed. Families gathered in a single room to conserve heat, huddling under blankets or shawls. Wealthier homes had grates in every chamber, but even they could not fully banish the drafts that slipped through window panes and under doors. In poor households, a single fireplace often had to heat an entire dwelling. Beds were layered with whatever could be found, quilts, coats, even sacks, while hot stones, wrapped in cloth, were placed at the foot of the bed to keep toes from freezing. Water itself became a challenge. Pumps froze, and fetching liquid meant breaking through ice or carrying heavy buckets over slippery paths. Baths, already rare for the poor, became almost impossible in winter for the wealthy. Bathing continued, but with steaming tubs filled by servants who carried hot water from kitchen to chamber. A laborious task repeated, bucket by bucket. Entertainment, too, adapted to the cold. The rich held winter balls, their candlelit rooms echoing with laughter, music, and the swish of gowns across polished floors. Sleigh rides through frosted parks became fashionable, though only for those who could afford them. The poor found joy in simpler ways, singing together, playing makeshift games, or gathering at public houses where warmth and ale brought momentary relief. Street performances sometimes persisted, with fiddlers or singers braving the cold in hopes of coins tossed their way. Even sleeping required strategy. Families often shared beds to conserve heat, children curled against parents. In workhouses, long rows of cots held the poor, each person wrapped tightly in thin blankets, their breath rising in clouds. Sleep was not always restful. The cold pressed into bones, and the noises of coughing, snoring, and shivering filled the air. Yet sleep, however fragile, was a repriever, chance to drift away from the endless struggle of survival. And so, day by day, Londoners endured. Every act, tying a scarf, boiling a potato, lighting a candle, became part of the battle against the season. It was not merely about living. It was about adapting, bending to winter's demands without breaking entirely beneath its. Winter in Victorian London was not only a battle against the cold, it was a season where sickness became as familiar as the fog, creeping through alleyways, lodging itself in lungs, and weaving tragedy into everyday life. The chill did not merely sting the skin, it entered the body, weakened it, and left entire communities vulnerable to illnesses that flourished in damp and freezing air. Respiratory diseases were the most common killers of the season. Tuberculosis, already rampant in crowded tenements, thrived in the cold months when weak bodies huddled together, breathing stale air in poorly ventilated rooms. The infamous London fog stick, with smoke and coal dust, clogged lungs further, triggering coughs that never seemed to end. What began as a cold often turned into pneumonia, bronchitis, or consumption. For the wealthy, physicians and private care offered some measure of defense, but for the poor, it was a different story. A persistent cough might mark the beginning of decline, a slow slipping away while family members looked on helplessly. Frostbite and hypothermia were quiet threats that stalked the streets. Children who wandered barefoot or with worn-out shoes risked losing toes to the bite of ice. Fingers grew black and stiff, wounds that festered in unheated rooms. Even those lucky enough to reach a charity hospital might find little comfort, as Victorian medicine had few remedies for frostbitten flesh. The poor often slept in doorways, under bridges, or huddled together in workhouses where the chill seeped in regardless, robbing them of life while they slept. Many bodies discovered in the mornings were said to have died of cold, a phrase that haunted the newspapers of the day. But cold was only one half of the equation. Malnutrition compounded every illness. Without enough food to build strength, the body became an easy prey for disease. A family surviving on bread crusts and weak tea could not fight infection, and children wasted away, their small bodies visibly shrinking against oversized coats. Rickets, caused by lack of sunlight and poor diet, bent bones and weakened limbs. Scurvy returned in the slums, not from voyages at sea, but from diets barren of fruit and vegetables. Winter made food expensive, and for many, hunger itself was a constant companioning weakening. and leaving behind shadows where once had been health. The public health system of Victorian London was ill-equipped to face these seasonal crises. Hospitals existed, but they were overcrowded, underfunded, and often avoided by the poor, who feared being treated like charity cases or being separated from their families. Workhouse infirmaries offered some shelter, but conditions there were grim rows of beds packed tight, air thick with sickness, and nurses overworked to exhaustion. The wealthy, of course, had private doctors who made house calls, bringing bottles of tinctures, warming drafts, and the comfort of attention. The poor, instead, turned to home remedies, onion poultices for coughs, mustard plasters for chills, gin to dull the ache of fever. Some sought out herbalists or even quack doctors promising miracle cures for a few pennies. Epidemics often reached their peak in winter. Influenza swept through the city in waves, felling both rich and poor alike. Diphtheria and scarlet fever were especially cruel to children, turning cold bedrooms into silent chambers of mourning. In tenements, where entire families shared 1 or 2 rooms, sickness moved like wildfire. A single cough could infect everyone, and death could follow swiftly, leaving behind orphans or grieving parents. Burial grounds filled with the dead of winter, carts carrying coffins through frosted streets, while mourners followed, muffled in black, their grief made heavier by the cold. Even for those who survived illness, winter left lasting scars. Weak lungs from pneumonia, missing fingers from frostbite, or stunted growth from years of malnutrition marked lives permanently. The poor carried these scars forward, reminders of winters survived but never truly escaped. The wealthy, by contrast, often spoke of winter as a season of elegance and festivity, a time of balls, sleigh rides, and glittering firesides. But for the lower classes, winter was more akin to a siege, a relentless assault on body and spirit alike. And yet, amid the sickness, there were also moments of resilience and care. Neighbors shared what little they had, offering broth, blankets, or simply companionship. Charities opened soup kitchens, providing hot meals to lines of shivering figures. Nurses and midwives, often drawn from the working class themselves, braved the cold to tend to the sick in their homes. Religious groups visited the poorest quarters, offering not only prayer but also coal, bread, and warmth. Though medicine was limited, compassion remained a force of survival for children. Winter sickness became a lesson in endurance. Many grew up accustomed to coughing through nights, to the sound of parents whispering worries over their weak bodies. Some survived by sheer will, carrying their fragile health into adulthood. Others did not. And in every household, grief became part of the rhythm of the season, candles burning low for the lost. Windows shuddered against the chill, hearts heavy with absence. Winter, then, was not simply a test of endurance against the weather. It was a crucible, one that revealed the vulnerability of human life, the failures of a society divided by class, and the unequal cost of survival. For the poor, every cough, every shiver, every pang of hunger was a reminder that winter was not a backdrop to life. It was a matter of life and death. And yet, year after year, they faced it, because there was no choice. If the biting cold and gnawing hunger were not enough, winter in Victorian London also carried with it a heavy burden of the spirit. It was a season that pressed not only against the body, but also upon the heart and mind. The long, endless nights seemed to stretch time itself, making suffering feel eternal. For the poor, whose days were already filled with uncertainty, winter deepened every worry, every fear, until despair itself became part of the season's chill. The darkness of winter arrived quickly and lingered. By mid-afternoon, the streets fell into shadow, the gas lamps flickering weakly through fog and mist. 4 families crammed into small rooms. This darkness brought with it a crushing sense of confinement. Without firelight, without candles, rooms dissolved into pitch black. The absence of light weighed heavily on the mind, breeding feelings of helplessness. Mothers sat quietly, rocking hungry children in the dark. Fathers returned from failed searches for work and sat in silence, staring at the floor. For the elderly, who already felt time slipping through their hands, these endless dark hours seemed like a slow descent into invisibility. Isolation was another companion of the season. The cold kept people indoors, separated by brick walls and thick fog, cut off from even the limited comfort of neighbors. Streets that were usually noisy, with voices, carts, and market cries fell quiet, muffled by snow or emptied by bitter winds. For those living alone, widows, orphans, the sick, the winter quiet could be unbearable. Loneliness became a sharp ache, just as cruel as hunger. But perhaps the most insidious weight of winter was what today we might call seasonal depression, though in Victorian times it had no name. The endless gray skies, the damp air, and the constant cold seeped into the soul. People spoke of feeling melancholy or low-spirited words that barely captured the deep sadness that overtook so many. Without distraction, without warmth, the mind drifted toward dark thoughts. The poorest, who already carried the burden of exhaustion and loss, found their spirits battered by each passing week of frost. The wealthy, shielded from these struggles, wrote about the romance of winter. Skating parties, carriages dashing through snow. For the poor, the same season was a kind of slow imprisonment. They dreamed not of sleigh rides, but of simple relief, warmth, bread, a break in the suffering. Even the joys of Christmas were often muted in the slums. While the upper classes feasted on goose, puddings, and fine wines, the poor celebrated with a crust of bread, or if fortune allowed a few small coals for the fire. And yet hope persisted. Even in the darkest rooms, people found ways to soften the despair. Neighbors shared stories to pass the long nights, keeping each other company with memories and laughter. Children, resilient even in hardship, invented games with scraps, their giggles brightening rooms otherwise filled with silence. Churches organized winter services, bringing together communities who sang hymns that rose like fragile sparks against the dark. Charities distributed candles, blankets, or even a single hot meal, small gifts that carried immense meaning to those who received them. The rituals of survival also became rituals of the spirit. Families gathered tightly together, drawing comfort from one another's presence. Mothers told stories to distract children from their hunger. Fathers carved small toys from wood to brighten an otherwise bleak holiday. These small acts of love became a form of resistance against despair. They reminded people that even in the hardest winters, they were not entirely alone. For many, hope was tied to the promise of spring. People whispered about the lengthening of days, the return of warmth. The thought of a thaw, however distant, became a lifeline. Each sunrise, no matter how pale or cold, carried with it the possibility that the end of winter was one day closer. Winter, then, was not only a physical ordeal, it was a psychological trial, a season that tested the endurance of the human heart. Those who survived it did so not only by braving the cold, but by clinging to the faint lights of companionship, ritual, and hope. And in this quiet struggle of the soul, winter revealed both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit. The brutal winters of Victorian London demanded more than endurance. They demanded ingenuity. For the poor, survival was a daily negotiation with the season itself, a constant search for ways to soften the bite of cold and stretch the meager resources that kept hunger and frost at bay. Life in those months became a delicate balancing act between necessity and possibility, shaped by creativity, stubbornness, and the relentless will to live. Work remained the first and most urgent form of survival. But in winter, work itself was hard to find. Many jobs, particularly those outdoors, simply disappeared when frost hardened the ground and snow covered the streets. Bricklayers, builders, and laborers often faced weeks with no employment. The docks froze, trade slowed, and casual workers were left wandering from one hiring yard to the next, hoping for scraps of work that rarely came. A man might stand in the cold for hours, waiting for a foreman to emerge and choose a handful of workers, while dozens were turned away. Left to return home empty-handed. Women, often the backbone of survival, adapted in quieter but equally desperate ways. They took in sewing or laundry, though water froze in tubs and stiffened cloth made work near impossible. Some sold matches, flowers, or trinkets on street corners, standing for hours in icy winds just to earn a few pennies. Others cleaned houses for the wealthy, scrubbing marble floors, while their own homes went unheated. In the most desperate cases, women turned to prostitution, risking disease and abuse simply to put food on the table. Children, too, became workers in the struggle against winter. Boys shined boots outside public houses, their fingers cracked and red from the cold polish. Girls sold violets or paper matches, their breath fogging the air as they called out for customers. Some scavenged for coal dropped on the roads, or sifted through dust heaps for scraps that could be sold. Winter robbed them of childhood, demanding they become contributors to family survival before they were even old enough to understand why. Beyond work, survival required improvised ingenuity. Families patched shoes with scraps of leather, wrapped rags around their feet, and lined coats with old newspapers to block the wind. Windows were stuffed with cloth to keep out drafts, while blankets were sewn from stitched-together rags. Food scraps were boiled and reboiled, turned into thin soups that might last several meals. Nothing was wasted. Potato peelings, stale bread, even animal bones simmered into broth that carried a whisper of nourishment. Heat was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Coal, already expensive, became nearly impossible for the poor to afford in winter's peak. Families scavenged wood from construction sites or gathered lumps of coal that fell from delivery carts. Some resorted to burning furniture, broken barrels, or anything flammable to keep even a brief fire alive. Many households huddled in one room, crowding together under layers of blankets or straw mattresses. It was common to see entire families asleep on the floor beside the hearth, taking turns feeding the fire with scraps of wood just to keep frost from settling on their breath. When private survival failed, the public systems of relief offered thin hope. Workhouses loomed as an option, though they were dreaded. Families who entered were often separated, men, women, and children housed apart. Inside, warmth was scant, food minimal, and discipline harsh. Yet for some, it was the only barrier between life and death. Others relied on soup kitchens, where steaming pots of broth were ladled into tin cups for long lines of shivering figures. Charitable organizations distributed blankets or coal tickets, small slips of paper redeemable for fuel. These gestures, though limited, could mean the difference between freezing and surviving another night. Still, for many, survival meant suffering in silence. Pride often kept the poor from seeking charity, and the fear of the workhouse discouraged countless families from asking for help until desperation forced their hand. Instead, they bore the cold together, clinging to the strength of kinship and community. Neighbors shared what they had, whether it was food, fire, or simply the company of another soul who understood the burden of the season, despite all the hardship. Survival strategies often revealed remarkable resilience. The poor of Victorian London lived lives that demanded resourcefulness. They found warmth where warmth was scarce, food where food seemed impossible, and dignity even in the face of desperation. Their daily struggles, though unseen by most of the wealthy, were victories in themselves, victories of endurance, stubbornness, and quiet strength. Winter was not kind. It punished the poor with merciless cold and endless obstacles. But each day they rose again, patched their clothes, braved the streets, and searched for ways to make it through. Each evening they gathered in the dim glow of whatever light or warmth they could muster, whispered stories to children, and prepared to face yet another day of the season's trial. In their perseverance, winter revealed not only its brutality, but also the unbreakable will of those who faced it with nothing but determination and hope. When we look back on Victorian London, the winters stand out not only as a season of weather, but as a mirror held up to society. They revealed, in stark relief, the contrast between the comfort of the wealthy and the suffering of the poor. Winter was not experienced equally. For one class, it was a time of festivity, sparkling lights, and cozy evenings by roaring fires. For another, it was a brutal ordeal season when every breath of icy air cut deeper. Every day of hunger felt longer, and every night threatened to be the last. The divide between rich and poor grew sharper in the cold months. Newspapers and novels of the day described Christmas feasts, glittering parties, and frost-covered streets lined with elegant carriages. Yet, only a few streets away, thousands of Londoners struggled to keep their children alive, surviving on crusts of bread, worn-out shoes, and fires fueled by scraps of wood. Winter made these contrasts impossible to ignore. It was the season when charity was most visible, when wealthy families gave to the poor with one hand, while their own tables groaned with abundance. The gap was not merely economic, it was existential. One class celebrated winter as beauty, while another endured it as suffering. For the poor, memory of winter was etched in the body. Survivors carried with them the coughs of lungs scarred by pneumonia, the bent limbs of rickets, the missing fingers of frostbite. These scars were permanent reminders of winters survived but never forgotten, even for those who escaped poverty later in life. Memories of cold nights, empty stomachs, and frost-covered windows never faded. Winter taught lessons in endurance, lessons learned young and carried for a lifetime. And yet, these winters also revealed something more: the strength of human resilience. The poor did not simply collapse under the weight of the season. They fought back with resourcefulness, with community, with love for one another. A neighbor sharing soup, a mother telling stories to calm her children, a father repairing shoes late into the night. These small acts became lifelines. They wove a fabric of resistance against despair, proving that even in the bleakest times, people could still nurture one another. Winter shaped the identity of Victorian London itself. The fog, the frost, the image of chimney smoke rising into a gray sky, these became part of the city's character, immortalized in the works of Dickens and others. But beneath the romance of Dickensian winters lay the truth: cold that killed, hunger that lingered, and suffering hidden in the shadows of alleyways and tenements. To romanticize the season is to remember only half the story. To honor the memory of those who lived, it is to acknowledge the full weight of its brutality. By the late Victorian era, reforms began to emerge: public health measures, housing improvements, better charitable networks. But for decades, countless winters had already taken their toll. Whole generations grew up knowing winter as the season that stole siblings, parents, and neighbors. And yet, they also knew it as the season that tested and proved their strength. Today, when we look back, we can see Victorian winters not only as history, but as lessons. They remind us of the fragility of life when society turns its back on the vulnerable. They remind us of the importance of compassion, of sharing warmth in all its forms. And perhaps most of all, they remind us that survival is never only about strength of body. It is about strength of spirit, of hope, and of the quiet bonds that connect one person to another. So, when the icy winds of winter swept through the cobbled streets of London, when fog blurred the gas lamps and snow silenced the city, life did not stop. It persisted, fragile, struggling, but alive. And in that persistence lies the true story of Victorian winter. Not only the brutality of the season, but the endurance of those who faced it with almost nothing and still found a way to endure.